Vance from the ESRB and Dan Ackerman. So I'll let them take it from here.
It's my great pleasure to be able to host this chat here. I'm Dan Ackerman. You may know me from CNET, and I'll mention that our new CNET magazine just came out in San this week. It's a quarterly review that's super fun. And you may also know me since we're talking about game ratings from the book I wrote about the greatest E-rated game of all time, and that's Tetris. The book is The Tetris Effect, and it talks about the secret Soviet Cold War history of Tetris. But I am super excited to be talking to Pat Vance, who's the president of the ESRB, the ratings board that, frankly, if you're making a game, you really want to make a big part of your game-making process. It's very important, especially depending on which platforms you want to be on. But it's also something that's been around for a long time, although I am old enough to remember before there was an ESRB and some of the factors that led to its creation. So I'd like Pat to start by maybe talking about, back in the early to mid-90s, what were some of the cultural and political factors that made it necessary to put together a ratings board for games, which is something that from the 70s on had not existed?
Well, I mean, basically, it's the threat of regulation. If we as an industry weren't going to provide rating information to consumers, the government was going to do it for us. There were a whole host of congressional hearings led by Senator Joe Lieberman and Senator Cole from Wisconsin. And the industry was essentially trotted out in front of Congress to justify their games and the content in their games. I think at that time also, which hasn't changed all that much today, but there's a strong perception that video games are for kids, and we all know that that's not really true. Sweet spot of the video games has always been 18 to 34, but that doesn't mean that necessarily the general public knows that, and certainly politicians will stand up whenever they feel that there's a potential for media coverage and talk about how video games are bad for kids, and they tend to get media. So the congressional hearings that were held in the 90s were very impactful and on the industry, and the industry got its act together and established the ESRB. We first set out to come up with a rating system. I wasn't there, by the way, I came in later, but set up a rating system, got a lot of input from academics and the scientific community and consumers, and came up with a rating system that was two parts: age ratings and content descriptors. And so we set out to start applying those. And the nice thing was that because it was industry created, it was industry adopted. So all of the platforms required it in order to get your game published on those systems. And the retailers, the major retailers, also required it because they wanted to offer it to their consumers and also protect themselves. So from a self-regulatory standpoint, it really did what it was meant to do, which is to inform consumers prior to purchase and make sure that the industry is acting responsibly. So ratings first, and then there were a whole host of other things that followed to enhance what we do from a self-regulatory standpoint.
I think especially at its introduction, I think you mentioned the retailers are such an important part of it, because
That's
especially back in the mid-90s, that was the only way to get games.
That's right.
You had to go into a store, and if the stores require it,
Right.
then it's pretty much going to happen. I remember that time. There was not just games; it was music, especially rap music and rock music, and
That's
even
right.
television. And you ended up around the same time with the explicit lyrics warning
That's
on
right.
records,
The
and
whole
you started
Tipper Gore
years,
thing,
not that many years later, you got into the TV ratings,
Yeah.
which are still a thing, which have similar content descriptors to game ratings. That makes me wonder, how close were we to that red line of actual content regulation legislation that we would think of as unimaginable as people familiar with the First Amendment? Yet, I feel like we were walking down that dangerous path. How close did we get before self-regulation
Well,
happened?
if you go back and look at the transcripts, I mean, it was the threats were real, and the industry took those threats pretty seriously. The industry had started in bits and pieces to kind of do things to disclose content or disclose age appropriateness, but it wasn't a standard. And standards are really important, not just for industry purposes and clarity, for developers, but also for consumers. Consumers shouldn't have to figure out a rating system for each device or game so the creation of a standard was very important. I mean, the reality is, if you ask most people, unfortunately, they think that ratings are the law, but neither the film ratings or the video game ratings or the music explicit labels are legally required anywhere. It is all self-regulation, and that's in great part to the First Amendment, which you mentioned. We had a famous case. Oddly enough, the state of California under Arnold Schwarzenegger passed a law, which he signed, to regulate the sale of violent video games. And it was ultimately taken to the Supreme Court and got shot down. Justice Scalia wrote the opinion. And what protected the industry, frankly, was the fact we had a really robust labeling system, our ratings, and we had a really robust program with retailers. And we developed this retail program when I joined the organization 15 years ago, where we actually self-audit as an industry. We bring in kids and with somebody watching in the background to see if they can purchase a mature rated video game without a parent. And we've been doing these audits for close to 15 years. And the reality is almost 9 out of 10 times the kid gets stopped. And no other industry, not even the liquor industry, has as good a record as we do. The Federal Trade Commission was looking at this for a while. They've stopped because we're doing such a good job. Federal Trade Commission is a very important regulatory authority when it comes to how product gets marketed, where it gets marketed. And so we have over the years developed, between ad guidelines and this program with retailers, a number of things that have just put the video game industry way ahead of its competitors in terms of film and how film regulates itself or music. So we have a lot to be proud of as an industry. Most developers, don't see us in necessarily a positive light, but the reality is we do protect the industry from regulation. We protect creative freedom for developers, which I know most developers wouldn't think of, but because of this robust system that we have, labeling, it really does protect you. As long as your product is labeled in this country, you can distribute it and market it. And
Because the stores will sell it.
well, not only will the store sell it, but you can't as a regulator, you can't criticize you from publishing a game with content that may be offensive to some people if it's properly labeled.
As every TV show is.
That's right. You've got an age rating on it. You've got content descriptors. Now for digital, we've interactive elements. So, there's a lot of information that we provide to consumers so that there are no surprises. And it would be hard to argue that you shouldn't be publishing a particular product because you're not informing the public. You are.
Now, you would think that once you set up the ratings, E and T and M, and you have a system of people getting them, that would be it. You could just put it on autopilot and go home. But the industry has changed so much, especially over the last 7 or 8 years. There was a shift I see from physical disc games to digital downloaded games. So you didn't have to go to the store. You didn't have the retailer as a kind of a policeman to stop you from buying the wrong game. And then we've shifted to digital only, things that are just distributed through app stores, through Steam, that were never had a physical product.
That's right.
How do you navigate these new worlds, and how do you make sure that ratings come with the games as they transition onto these new platforms?
That's right. So, physical games, we created a system. You submit your product in advance of going gold, but in advance of manufacturing. You get your rating. You go put that rating on the boxes and all the marketing materials, and you ship it out. And we have a very robust pre-review process. For digital, we fairly early discovered we were going to need to develop a scalable solution that was also more affordable for indie developers. And so we started out, actually, took my head of ratings and basically locked him in a room and said, you've got to figure out a way to make this binary multiple choice question, break it down in your head, make it, yes, no, and see if you can't figure out an algorithm that will get close enough to assigning a rating, assuming the developer obviously answers the questions correctly, which in virtually all cases they do. And then we would automate that and then test and monitor after the fact and be able to change ratings fairly quickly. In digital, that's really easy. In physical, it's not. And so, lo and behold, we created a process for digital. We started out with a relatively finite market, which was the console downloadable market, and launched it for the industry with a small fee attached to it, and then eventually eliminated the fee. And it worked. And then we took that system to the CTIA, which was the mobile trade association. They adopted it, and then most of those phone companies got out of the business of the app storefronts once Google and Apple kind of dominated that. And then we took that system to rating authorities around the world and said, if you want to be in the digital market or the mobile market, we need a globally coordinated system, because obviously, as you all know, if you're developers, you launch a product globally, and that's the default. And we needed a system that could automate that, and particularly in mobile with 1 million, 2 million apps in the store, we needed to be able to rate all of that. And you needed a scalable solution, which this was. None of the other rating authorities around the world, which oftentimes are government authorities, by the way, because they don't have a First Amendment. So film ratings and TV ratings and game ratings are government regulated. So we created this system called the International Age Rating Coalition, or that was the company, and we created a platform that is essentially an enterprise solution. I mean, it hooks into the back ends of app storefronts. Developers complete the questionnaire. The algorithm is different for each region. So you may get a different region in Europe, a different rating in Europe versus Germany versus US versus Brazil versus Australia, whatever, and it automates that whole process. So in the old days, and still to a certain extent in the physical game space, you have to submit your game to each regional rating authority. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's laborious, and this system, IARC, eliminates all of that. So IARC has been adopted by the Google Play Store. So all apps in the Google Play Store go through the system. Oculus adopted it. It's also available in the Microsoft Store. So for all developers marketing their game in the Microsoft Store, go through the system. It's in the process of rolling it out, in the process of being rolled out for all Xbox developers. Again, this is only for digital and mobile. It's not for physical. And then PlayStation developers are going to have access to it pretty soon too. So it's becoming the standard for how games in digital and mobile are being rated.
Yeah, the two most interesting things, the two things I was most curious about in talking to you earlier was, number one, the automation, which seems like a fascinating process, and this rating sharing around the world where you do it once and then you find a way to translate that rating. And it seems both of those things are so important, because I must imagine just the physical workload must have exploded exponentially over the last 5 or so years with the growth of indie games and mobile games and Steam games and early access, and the fact that there's just hundreds of thousands more games now, when before you had a handful of big titles that had to be pressed on a disc and put in a truck and taken to the store. How is the workload like now, and is the automation the real key to making sure everything gets done?
Yeah, well, the automation is key, certainly in digital and mobile. And what we do is we monitor after the facts, and because of this global organization, we can actually share testing results with each other. We pretty much trust other rating authorities for being pretty thorough, and we share those results so we can maximize make the resources much more efficient in terms of our reach. And the reality is if you look at usage, this is no secret, although there may be 2 million apps in the App Store, there are only several thousand that are really active, right? So you want to make sure you cover all of those, which is very doable. And then you try to cover your bases with the rest, but you need to focus on where the activity is, which is really important.
So if you're an indie developer and you're answering a questionnaire to generate your rating, how often do you guys put human eyes on it after the fact to kind of double check and go back and see?
Depends on the platform. Again,
are there flags?
No, I mean we'll pretty much look at everything on consoles and certainly all the top downloads, and I'm talking about top being the top 4,000 or 5,000. So we're all over all that. So we're and we haven't needed to expand our resources that much to handle this. So, and in part because we're sharing resources across different regions and different regulatories too.
And I was very interested in what you said about getting into the Oculus store now and these other storefronts. They're all laid out differently. They're all run differently. Back when you had a retail box, you had a corner of the box, and it was the size the rating had to be, and that was it. How do you work across these different platforms to make sure that the rating is visible, that people carry it, that they don't hide it on a secondary page of information?
Well,
is
the
that
nice thing that gets standardized by the storefront, so the developer doesn't even need to worry about it. In fact, we feed the ratings to the storefronts, and we correct ratings directly with the storefront. So the developer, all they have to do is make sure they answer the questions properly. And if the content should change, they need to retake the questionnaire, and they need to do that responsibly and diligently. But it's a light touch system for developers. It's really the storefront does all, and us can do all of the work. And the storefront has a template where the rating information gets displayed in their store, and it's on the product detail page, and usually there's something above the fold, and then there's usually more information somewhere below the fold or prior to, making sure that it's prior to purchase.
And the storefronts have all been good about putting it above the fold.
Yeah.
There haven't been a lot of push and pull.
That's right. I mean, real estate's particularly on small devices. Real estate's precious, and we get that. So we've tried to be flexible. In the old days, everything had to be all above the fold and prominently displayed, and with specific sizes. You can't go, under. We're a little bit more flexible in the digital mobile world because we have to be.
Right, and so that's a challenge. What are some of the other big challenges that games present today that maybe they didn't use to my mind? Obviously, online interactions come to mind.
Sure.
User-generated content. So many games are about building your own stuff. How do you work? Is that the biggest challenge, and how do you work with that?
Well, we do a lot of research every year. I mean, not only we have our annual questions among parents of kids who play video games. We make sure we know if they're aware of the ratings. 84% of parents are aware, by the way. If they're using the ratings, 71% are regularly using the ratings, either all the time or most of the time, they say. And then we start to dig in, and it's different year to year depending on what's going on in the market, but we dig in to see where parental concerns are. And look, that's really our audience. We want to make sure that information is really, the information we provide really serves parents. Now that doesn't mean that other consumers can't find value in it, but nevertheless parents do. What we find parents are really concerned about is location tracking and location sharing. So we have an interactive element notice now called shares location. If it's a game or an app that tracks location and then shares it with other users. We know that in-app purchases is a big deal, and so we have a digital purchases notice. Unrestricted internet access, particularly for younger ages, is an issue for many parents, and we want to make sure that those apps that provide that you have a notice for that. And users interact. Now, we've always had disclaimers about UGC and user interaction, and there's kind of no way we can rate that. I hope everybody appreciates that. So we've disclaimed it and provided notices on boxes and physical games for a long time about online play. And in the digital space, we have an interactive element descriptor that or notification that says users interact. So that will cover you if you are concerned about user interaction. And we know that parents are concerned about it, both from a content standpoint and language standpoint. Language can get pretty rough in some games. But they also are concerned about it, just the stranger danger sort of concern that many parents immediately gravitate towards, even though we've seen very little evidence of that in games, but nevertheless it's there.
If you see it, you hear it, you want to respond to it. And I think the online privacy indicators is such an important thing that maybe does not get played up enough. Looking at a lot of other industries, I see especially the smart toy business constantly get hit. At least once a year, there's a gigantic scandal where you have kids register and they put some of their information in, and it's on an unprotected database somewhere, and you're not aware that it's being shared remotely.
Well, I'm glad you bring up privacy, because it's an area we started out many years ago, making sure that we had a robust program for the industry to opt into if they wanted our help. And it's called ESRB Privacy Certified, and we're actually a safe harbor for COPPA violations. And if those of you in the audience don't know what COPPA is, it's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which was passed in 1999. And it's very restrictive when it comes to the collection of information from kids. And if you're a developer, you not only have to be familiar with COPPA, but you have to be familiar with what's going on in Europe now. There's a new regulation, very robust regulation, that's going into effect next May, that requires consent prior to collecting any information. And that's everything. You have to be careful now with data analytics. You have to be careful with any sort of ad serving technology. If you have to build with privacy in mind from the beginning when you develop a game or an app. It's just critical now. There's so much regulation.
No, and especially even if you only collect like the first name from a kid, but then you have more detailed information about the parents, and they're linked in your database, which inevitably gets hacked, as so many of these do. Such a minefield.
Right, and notice. I mean, you have to be very careful with your privacy policy. So first thing is know what you're doing and know what's being collected and shared with third parties. And the second piece is make sure that your privacy policy is robust and everything is disclosed in that privacy policy, and you are updating it on a regular basis.
So a lot of the people here at this event, I imagine, are small or indie developers. A lot of them may be one-man bands who have found ways to publish games inexpensively. The barriers to entry to the market have just fallen so much thanks to Steam and other platforms. But this may seem like something that only big companies have to worry about. It's out of reach. The two questions I think we could walk people through is number one, what's a little bit of the process like getting started, getting a rating for my game that maybe I see on Steam at some point soon? And I think more importantly for these indie guys who usually work on very fast turnarounds, at what point during the development cycle do I start that conversation with you guys?
Well, it's different if you've got a physical game versus a digital-only game. So if you've got a physical game, you can start at any time asking us questions. We have a very informal pre-review process. If you're developing a particular sequence, you have a particular rating in mind that you want your product to be marketed with, you can call us at any time. There's no charge, there's no fee. We are available for developers to do that. But then once you get close to gold, and usually when you're in the sort of final QA process, that's when you need to assemble all your materials together. Is an extensive written form with a bunch of questions, and you've got to fill out the answers to that. It's not a multiple choice questionnaire. And then you've got to put together a video. You've got to capture that gameplay footage that's pertinent to the rating in particular, but also within the context of the typical gameplay. In the ratings business, we don't want to see everything because games can be repetitive. And
you want to sit through 100 hours of a game?
Yeah, you burn out raters like nothing if you see the same thing over and over and over again. But we do rely on developers to be smart about how they put those materials together and thorough. And then that process does cost money. If you've developed a product for under $1 million, it's a pretty low fee. If it's over $1 million, the fees can get
And
more
if you're just
expensive.
indie digital only,
And if it's digital only, we do have something we call the short form, which developers can register for, and it costs nothing. You just have to get your rating through a questionnaire and use it. You can use that rating only on digital games. You cannot use it on physical games. If you've got if you're marketing, if you're releasing your product on a storefront like Xbox or PlayStation or Nintendo eShop, or on Oculus or Google Play, you can use the IARC questionnaire, and then you don't have to fill out that form every time you bring your game to a different platform. As long as it's an IARC platform, you can just put in your code, and the rating information will be called up by the storefront. So, it varies depending on which platform you use.
if you're a digital only developer, what's the turnaround time like? Because a lot of these guys,
It's immediate.
Immediate, okay.
You fill it out, you hit complete, you get your rating. That's it. Immediate. And for IARC, it's immediate for 6 different rating authorities around the world. I mean, Brazil is participating, Australia is participating. Those are 2 government rating agencies. You got USK in Germany. You have PEGI in Europe. We are in the process, hopefully, of getting some Asian rating authorities participating soon, and then you'll get a generic rating for the rest of the world. So we're, and obviously an ESRB rating in North America.
So with all the work that the ESRB has done over 20-something years, is the regulatory risk, government regulatory risk, dead? Is it a danger in the U.S., in other countries? Where's the danger the greatest?
Well, there's still very much a threat from regulators in a variety of different areas. I mean, look, and the reality is in the U.S., all it takes is one school shooting, and all of a sudden there's more attention focused. I mean, if you look at what happened after Newtown, we as an industry, were the target of a lot of, bad publicity, and some of it was political. But the NRA uses, in the U.S., the NRA uses the video game industry essentially as a scapegoat and says it's not us, it's not the guns, it's the video games. And so that's a strategy that they use. So from a content standpoint, there's always the threat. Although I think it's less, particularly since the Supreme Court case decision in 2011, I think it's been less so from a content standpoint. But marketing to kids remains a very active area of regulatory risk, and especially the FTC. And although they may be less actively monitoring our industry since Columbine, because the FTC had to report to Congress every couple of years on the marketing of violent entertainment to kids after Columbine. Those reports haven't been funded for a couple of years, but again, all it takes is one horrible event, and that could start happening again. So I think we need to be vigilant on the content side and on the marketing side. But privacy is really where a lot of the activity is shifted, and I think it's really important that we are really careful. I mean, there's been, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but there were a couple of class action lawsuits against Disney and Nickelodeon last week about the use of third-party data in their apps, and these are 2 companies that are really careful. So it's just important to make sure that whether it's federal regulation, whether it's European regulations, which are, as I said, are even in some cases stricter than in the U.S. Developers have to be really careful on this stuff. So
I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions. So I'll just ask you one last question. If you could whisper in the ears of indie developers who may not be thinking about ratings as a top of mind thing when they're trying to put together their game, what advice would you whisper to them? What do you wish they knew that they may not know?
Yeah. Oftentimes developers don't get ratings unless they have to. And I would love for developers to think about how ratings actually help them. And as I had mentioned before, really protect their creative freedom. So if using standards is really important, and you may not think it's important within your own little sphere, but if you're launching a product, you need to be thinking about disclosing and informing your consumers, and ratings really help towards that. Good privacy policies help towards that, and responsible marketing. It's just kind of the ABCs of being of good business. Yeah.
Do we have time for a question or two? Okay. Sorry, guys. All right. Well, thank you. And thank you. Really great.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. One more big round of applause for Dan Ackerman and Pat Vance. Very informative. Great. So just real quick, as we're sort of wrapping up with the talks and panels for today, we do have one more a performance piece actually coming up shortly after I finish here. But I just wanted to take an opportunity before everyone was going, and also for anybody who's watching on the stream as well, just again to highlight, this is the first year of Play NYC, and it's a small team that worked really hard to bring this event to New York. And a lot of that was with the support of the extremely passionate developer community here, and we really want to see this grow and be something that can help New York and East Coast and developers worldwide make the East Coast a home for making video games. So anything that you can do, anything that you had, something you learned today, positive experiences you had over the weekend, please share with your communities and let them know that we're out here, because if you guys aren't involved and don't tell us what we can do, then we can't make it better. So that's what we want to do. So thanks again, and to all of you for coming out and supporting Play NYC.
And hang on and see the performance. Yeah.